Hello again, my name is Connor Hargis. This is my video for the grief counseling course with Dr. Jobert. This video is going to be about anticipatory grief. Anticipatory grief is essentially the grieving process starting before the person dies. Up in this class, up until now, we've mostly talked about grieving after a person's died. However, if the if the death process takes a long time, if the person is sick, for example, if it's an elderly person with cancer that is taking many months to progress and get worse until the person finally dies, that period before death can also often be the start of the grief, not after the person dies. And grieving during that time period is called anticipatory grief. It's what Warden calls it in our text. So this is an important distinction to make, that grief does not always occur immediately after the loss. It often occurs before the loss. This can also happen with parents beginning their grief of a terminally ill child before the child passes away. I thought this was a very interesting chapter and topic. It's not something I'd previously thought about. Some of the signs and symptoms of anticipatory grief include basically some of the same signs that regular grief has, but before the person has died. So emotional distress, anxiety, maybe some depressive signs, some sadness, preoccupation or even obsession with the impending loss of the person. Some changes in behavior, especially like withdrawal from other people and the person who is dying, social isolation, or some irritability just because these negative emotions are just constant. There can also be, according to our text, basically an overcompensation for this grief by, for example, if someone is in the hospital, let's say it's the mother of 3 children who are grown, and those grown children are basically sublimating their grief into overcare and trying to do way too much to improve the mother's situation, trying all these non-traditional medical techniques, interfering with the staff and the doctors, and just spending this obsessive amount of time on that as a way to express their grief. It can also lead to fatigue, even insomnia. And so, like I said, a lot of these signs are typical of grief, but they're happening before the person has died. So one of the main questions in our prompt was, does anticipatory grief shorten the bereavement process? So instead of beginning grieving after the person has died, does having that period of anticipatory grief make the grief after the death shorter and or less intense? So according to our text, there have been studies that show that it does make a slight effect, that it does provide a slight benefit. However, there are also conflicting studies that say there's no benefit. It can also even be counterproductive for grief because it extends the time of anxiety, sadness, grief, especially if it's a very long process of death, and the family or the loved ones have no idea when this person is going to die. That stress is just built up and stays before the death, and so the death can almost even feel like a sense of relief, which can lead to guilt. And so it just depends on the situation. The author discusses, give me one moment. Yeah, so he talks about, with regard to task 2, sometimes that is actually made worse by anticipatory grief, but task 1 is actually helped with this period of anticipation in general. I mean, obviously there are exceptions. One thing to note that Warden also discusses is that the person dying also can feel a sense of anticipatory grief and experience that, because usually we think of the family or the loved ones feeling that anticipatory grief, but the person who is sick or about to die, they can start to go through their own process of grieving, because they're grieving their relationships, they're grieving their everything that they had in life. And so that's an important note that I wanted to add. As far as a personal experience with anticipatory grief, my grandmother was the last of my grandparents to die. Called her grandma. Her children are very type A people. My mother, her two sisters, and her brother, uh, who so my grandmother lived in Bernie near San Antonio, and my mother, her brother live in Houston. Her other sister lives in San Antonio, and her third sister lives in Colorado. But the ones that lived in Texas, her sister and her brother and herself, they all spent. It took a long time for my grandmother's condition to worsen. She was very old, 89. And so they spent a lot of time and energy grieving, and also sublimating, as I talked about earlier, that grief into overcare of their mother. They would spend hours on the phone with the doctor. They would spend hours talking to each other about her situation, what to do about it. They would spend hours talking about the possibilities of her recovery, which was basically not a possibility. How to make her more comfortable. A lot of things that were helpful, but they also went way too far in doing that. And in my opinion, this sublimation of grief, actually caused way more stress than if my grandmother had died suddenly in her sleep, for example. I think that would have been much easier on my mom and her siblings than the situation that occurred, which was this long, extended period of stress, not knowing when my grandmother would die, when their mother would die, not knowing the best thing to do, and just constantly absorbed by it, and in addition to all their day-to-day normal stressors. However, I didn't read the studies that Warden references that says that anticipatory grief can shorten the bereavement process, but I imagine that if the grief is handled in an appropriate way, perhaps with assistance from a counselor, which I'll discuss in a moment, that the grieving process, they can actually truly begin to grieve and say goodbye. And one of the best ways that anticipatory grief can help is it allows a time period for family and loved ones to say goodbye, to say the things that they wish they had always said, or that they wanted to say but were too afraid or didn't want to say for whatever reason. It can also open up forgiveness, apologies, and basically a sense of closure. And in that sense, anticipatory grief can be a great help. Unfinished, like I'm gonna read something from Warden here. Unfinished business, which basically can be taken care of during the anticipatory grief period. Unfinished business does not simply mean that wills and other matters of estate or material things, but being able to express both appreciation and disappointment, things that need to be said before the person dies. If the counselor can encourage family members and patients to have this kind of communication, this pre-death period can have a very salutary effect on all concerned. When these things are expressed, survivors may not have to spend time later on grief counseling, where they might have to deal with regrets over things that were never said when they had the opportunity. So then he goes on to discuss if we as counselors have an opportunity to basically facilitate this communication between the family or the loved ones, spouse, etc., and the dying person, that can provide tremendous relief to both parties. And he later says that this communication and the sense of closure and taking care of this unfinished business is not often, usually it doesn't occur on its own. Usually the family or the dying loved one do not start this process on their own, and having a counselor or some staff member or doctor, anyone, but probably best to have it done by a counselor. But having that counselor step in and explain the importance of doing this, and maybe give some examples of how to begin this process of talking about disappointments, appreciation, forgiveness, etc., that can really get the process going and help the family. Um, I personally have a couple ideas about how to do this. Personally, I can imagine that speaking, let's say, to the children of the dying loved one in private about the need for talking about this sometimes difficult topic of unfinished business can help them begin to think about what to say to their loved one and how to say it and at what time, etc. And then together with both the dying loved one and the family in the room, maybe very gently guiding that process through comments or a question or some other way. Next, just so that was one of the counseling approaches. It's also necessary to provide a safe and empathetic place for bereaved clients to express their feelings about the long process of death of their loved one. Active listening, validating emotions, typical counseling techniques. Also, importantly, some coping strategies, distraction, mindfulness, meditation, and having their own support networks with other people, friends that have lost loved ones, etc., can really help. So, in conclusion, anticipatory grief is a very helpful, sometimes, and necessary part of grieving that is the grief, as I mentioned earlier, does not occur only after the death. It can occur prior to it, and that was a new thing for me to learn. And that's all I have for today. Thank you very much.